far we have finished the one sub-event in the pre-fertilization event. So that is gametogenesis. That is production of microspore and megaspore. Okay, so what we have studied so far. So what is the female reproductive part? Female reproductive structure, male reproductive structure. What are those? The female reproductive structures are, you can write simple meaning. Pistil is also called as a carpel or gynoecium. Yes, what is the male reproductive structure? Androecium, or it is also called as stem. Okay, what are the respective gametes they produced and where the gamete production takes place? Okay, so that is in the female gametophyte. So here it is in the male gametophyte. What are those male and female gametophyte? Female gametophyte, in yesterday sessions only we have finished. Embryo sac is the female gametophyte. What is the male gametophyte? Pollen grains. Okay, now what they produce? Okay, what are the male and female gametes? What they contain? They in the embryo sac, egg cell, right? In pollen grain, 2 male nuclei, right? Okay, yes. So this is what so far we have studied. Okay, it may be the structure, internal and external structure of reproductive parts, structures, the gametogenesis, that is microsporogenesis and megasporogenesis, and next the development of the female gametophyte as well as the male gametophyte. Now the next step, the gametes are produced here. Okay, so the first event is gamete production, right? So now we have the gametes now, right? So what happens now? There will be fusion of gametes. Okay, before the fusion of gametes, we know they are present in a distance. They are produced in their separate reproductive structures which are far away from each other. So they should be get reached. They should be together to perform the fertilization. So what happens? There will be transfer of the male gametes near the female gametes for what? For the process fertilization. Okay, to perform the fertilization, they should be together. Okay, for fusion, they need to transfer. Okay, they need to travel. So this transfer, we call it as the next process, that is pollination. Okay, gamete transfer, and we are going to study the pollination in detail. So ಏನು ಮಾಡಿದೀವಿ? So ಇಷ್ಟು ದಿನ ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಚರ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಸ್ಟಡಿ ಮಾಡಿದೀವಿ, gametogenesis ನ ಸ್ಟಡಿ ಮಾಡಿದೀವಿ ಸಪರೇಟ್ ಆಗಿ, and we know there are different gametes are formed. ಇವಾಗ ಏನು ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಪ್ರೊಸೆಸ್ ಫರ್ಟಿಲೈಸೇಷನ್ಗೆ ಹೋಗಬೇಕು ಅಂದರೆ, so they need to travel because they are present in the distance. ಹೌದಾ? ಬೋತ್ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಇಮ್ಯಾಜಿನ್ ಅ ಫ್ಲವರ್ನ ಇಮ್ಯಾಜಿನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ರಿ. ಸೊ ಫ್ರಾಮ್ ದ ಆಂಥರ್ ಪೋಲನ್ ಗ್ರೈನ್ ಏನಾಗಬೇಕು? ದೇ ನೀಡ್ ಟು ಟ್ರಾವೆಲ್ ಆನ್ ದ ಸರ್ಫೇಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಸ್ಟಿಗ್ಮಾ. ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಈಸಿ ಟು ಟ್ರಾವೆಲ್ ಟು ದ ಸರ್ಫೇಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಸ್ಟಿಗ್ಮಾ. ಸೊ ವಾಟ್ ಹ್ಯಾಪನ್ಸ್? ಗ್ಯಾಮೇಟ್ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಫರ್ ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆ ಇದೆ. ಸೊ ದಟ್ ಕೈಂಡ್ ಆಫ್ ಗ್ಯಾಮೇಟ್ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಫರ್ ಇನ್ ಪ್ಲಾಂಟ್ಸ್ we call it as pollination, and this pollination we are going to study in detail. Okay. So what is meant by pollination? Pollination means the process of transfer of pollen grains, from anther to the surface of stigma. We call it as pollination. What happens? So transfer of pollen grains. Where the pollen grains are produced? Anther. From the anther, and where they should perform the fertilization? So within the gynosium. But until reaching ovary, they need to land on the landing surface, and we know what is that landing surface called as? Stigma. So what happens? The pollen grain from the anther get transferred on the surface of stigma. This process we call it as pollination. Okay, so simple definition, 1 marks question they may ask. Okay, define pollination. So based on the type of transfer, okay, so this pollination is basically classified into self-pollination. I know you have already studied in your lower standards, okay, about the pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. So these are the two different kinds, important type of pollination. Sometimes this self-pollination is also called as autogamy, okay, and cross-pollination is called as allogamy or xenogamy. Okay, so self-pollination is called as autogamy, it is called as autogamy. Cross-pollination is called as allogamy or xenogamy. Okay, so this self-pollination or self-pollination, we know that is one is autogamy. Sometimes one another pollination phenomenon will come, so that we call it as geitonogamy. Okay, so actually this geitonogamy considered as a cross pollination, but they are similar to the self pollination. They are considered as cross. While studying, we can say the geitonogamy as a cross pollination, but by some of the characteristics it kept under the self pollination. Why? I'll tell you. Okay, so what is self pollination? So what happens? So we know what happens from the anther, the pollen grains, okay, get transferred into where? Yes, stigma of the flower. Okay, so this simple, we call it as pollination. The pollen grain from the anther get transferred to the surface of stigma. So in self-pollination, what happens? This transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma takes place in a same flower. Okay, this transfer takes place in the same flower. Like hibiscus example we can tell. So flower which contains, okay, this is gynosium and this is our anther. Consider this as a flower. Here what happens? So from the anther, the pollen grains are get transferred on the stigma of the same flower. Okay, This pollination takes place in the same flower, hence it is called as self-pollination or auto, means self, right? Understood? So this is what we call it as self-pollination. Okay, so because of the self-pollination, so what happens? They doesn't show any kind of variations. So we can write no genetic variations, because the pollen grain is of the same flowers itself. So what happens when they get fused with the egg of that ovary? So what happens? The developed seed, from the seed the developed plants, they doesn't show any differences, variations. So hence, so there is no genetic variations. So this is what self-pollination. Okay, so what is geitonogamy? As I said, sometimes called as a cross, or they are considered in self-pollination. Why? Because of, consider a single plant with two flowers. Okay, with two flowers. So what happens? Just imagine a flower. As we know the sexuality, what we have studied, the sometimes the flowers may be unisexual or bisexual. Consider here what kind of a flower it is. Bisexual flower, right? The flower which contains both male as well as female reproductive part. Just imagine a plant contains flowers, that is sometimes pistillate, and staminate, that is a different unisexual flower. This flower is pistillate flower, and this flowers are what? Staminate, right? Staminate flower, that is male flower. Okay, and female flower. Then to pollinate the stigma in this flower, there is no anthers or stamens, and here to pollinate with the for the pollination, they don't have pistillates. Now what happens? Okay, within the same plant, the pollination takes place between two different flowers. This is what we call it as geitonogamy. What happens? The anther which is produced from pollen grain which is produced from get transferred into the stigma of different flowers. So what we can write here? Pollination between different flower. But what is the condition? But in the same plant. Okay, in the same plant, that we call it as geitonogamy. Or this geitonogamy, sometimes it is also called as it is also shown not only the unisexual flower undergo geitonogamy, even sometimes the bisexual flowers also. Like imagine these two are flowers. Okay, these two are flowers with both androecium and gynoecium together. Okay, there are even both the reproductive system, that is bisexual flowers. Then also what happens? There is a transfer. If the pollen grain which is produced from this anther, what happens? They may get transferred to the stigma of this flower, or from here the pollen grains, they get transferred into the stigma of this flowers also. So don't get confused. So ಈ ಗೀಟೆನೋಗ್ಯಾಮಿ ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್, ಆಟೋಗ್ಯಾಮಿ ಅಂದರೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೋದು ನಿಮಗೆ. ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಫರ್ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ? ಒಂದೇ ಸೇಮ್ ಫ್ಲವರಲ್ಲಿ ಆಗುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಓಕೆ. ಬಟ್ ಗೀಟೆನೋಗ್ಯಾಮಿ ಏನಾಗ್ಬೋದು, ಇಟ್ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಬಿ yes between the two bisexual flowers of the same plant or unisexual flowers of the same plant. ಒಂದೇ ಪ್ಲಾಂಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಎರಡು ಫ್ಲವರ್ಸ್ ಗಳ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಆಗುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್ಗೆ ನಾವು ಏನಂತೀವಿ, ಗೀಟೆನೋಗ್ಯಾಮಿ. ಯಾಕೆ ಅದನ್ನ ಕ್ರಾಸ್ ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕನ್ಸಿಡರ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ? ವೈ ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಕನ್ಸಿಡರ್ಡ್ ಇನ್ ಕ್ರಾಸ್ ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್? ವೈ? ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಆಫ್ there is a pollination between two different flowers. Okay, the thing happens in cross pollination also. There will be a pollination between two flowers, but the difference is here between two different plants. But here what is the condition? Two different flowers but within the same plant. ಎರಡು ಫ್ಲವರ್ಸ್ ಗಳ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್, ಆದ್ರೆ ಕಂಡೀಷನ್ ಏನು, ಆಗುವಂಥದ್ದು ಒಂದೇ ಪ್ಲಾಂಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ. ಓಕೆ, ಒಂದೇ ಪ್ಲಾಂಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿರೋ ಡಿಫ್ರೆಂಟ್ ಫ್ಲವರ್ಸ್ ಗಳ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಆಗುವಂತ ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್ ಅನ್ನು ನಾವೇನಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ, ಗೀಟೆನೋಗ್ಯಾಮಿ. ಇಫ್ ಒಂದೇ ಸೇಮ್ ಫ್ಲವರ್ ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್ ಆಯಿತು ಅಂದರೆ ಅದನ್ನ ಏನಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ, ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್. ಓಕೆ, ನಾವು ವಿಲ್ ಗೋ ಟು ದ ಕ್ರಾಸ್ ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್. ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಡಿಫ್ರೆನ್ಸ್ನ ಹೇಳ್ಬಿಡ್ತೀನಿ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಕೆಲವೊಂದು ಕಂಡೀಷನ್ಸ್ಗಳಿದೆ ಅದನ್ನು ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪ್ಲೇನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ ಹಿಯರ್ ವಾಟ್ ಹ್ಯಾಪನ್ಸ್, ಕನ್ಸಿಡರ್ ದಿಸ್ ಆಸ್ ಟೂ ಡಿಫ್ರೆಂಟ್ plants. Okay, these as two different plants. What happens, they contain flowers. Okay, so what happens, okay, so now just imagine, so these are two different plant A and plant B. So what happens now, just imagine here the pollen grains are formed within this plant. Flower produced pollen grains. Cross pollination or allogamy or xenogamy, what happens, from one flower to the another flower of two different plants. This kind of pollination we call it as cross pollination. So what happens, even yes, condition is pollination between different flowers of different plants. So you can see plant B transferred the pollen grains to plant A flower, vice versa. Plant A flower indanu pollen grains plant B flower ge transfer ಆಗಬಹುದು. So this is called as a cross pollination. As you have seen the different pollination between different flowers. So hence geitonogamy sometimes considered as cross pollination. But why they are different from cross pollination? Because of here between the two plants pollination ಆಗಿರೋದ್ರಿಂದ there will be mix up of two different characters. So hence, so they show what? Here we can write, they show genetic variations. Because ಎರಡು ಡಿಫ್ರೆಂಟ್ ಪ್ಲಾಂಟ್ಸ್ ಆಗಿರೋದ್ರಿಂದ, ಸೊ ಒಂದರಿಂದ ಇನ್ನೊಂದಕ್ಕೆ ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್ ಏನು ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಫರ್ ಆಗೋದ್ರಿಂದ, ಸೊ ವಿ ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ಸಿ ಎಸ್ ದ ಜೆನೆಟಿಕ್ ಡಿಫ್ರೆನ್ಸ್. ಓಕೆ, ಬಟ್ ಬೋತ್ ಇನ್ ಗೀಟೆನೋಗ್ಯಾಮಿ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಆಟೋಗ್ಯಾಮಿ ವಾಟ್ ಹ್ಯಾಪನ್ಸ್, ದರ್ ಇಸ್ ನೋ ಜೆನೆಟಿಕ್ ವೇರಿಯೇಷನ್ಸ್. ಯಾಕೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಜೆನೆಟಿಕ್ ವೇರಿಯೇಷನ್ಸ್ ಇಲ್ಲ? ಇಮ್ಯಾಜಿನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ರಿ, ಟೂ ಡಿಫ್ರೆಂಟ್ ಪ್ಲಾಂಟ್ಸ್ಗಳ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್ ಆಗಿಲ್ಲ, ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಟೂ ಡಿಫ್ರೆಂಟ್ ಫ್ಲವರ್ಸ್ಗಳ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಬಟ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಸೇಮ್ ಪ್ಲಾಂಟಲ್ಲಿ ಎರಡು ಫ್ಲವರ್ಸ್ಗಳ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಆಗೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಜೆನೆಟಿಕ್ ವೇರಿಯೇಷನ್ಸ್ ಕಂಡು ಬರಲ್ಲ. ಯಾಕಂದರೆ ಒಂದೇ ಪ್ಲಾಂಟ್ ಇರುತ್ತೆ, ಒಂದೇ ಜೀನ್ಸ್ ಕಂಪೋಸಿಷನ್ಸ್ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವುದೇ ಒಂದು ಜೆನೆಟಿಕ್ ವೇರಿಯೇಷನ್ಸ್ ಇರಲ್ಲ. ಬಟ್ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಕ್ರಾಸ್ ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾಕೆ ಜೆನೆಟಿಕ್ ವೇರಿಯೇಷನ್ಸ್ಗಳಿರುತ್ತೆ? ವೈ ದ್ಯಾರ್ ಇಸ್ ಜೆನೆಟಿಕ್ ವೇರಿಯೇಷನ್ಸ್? ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ದ ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್ ಈಸ್ ಬಿಟ್ವೀನ್ ಟೂ ಡಿಫ್ರೆಂಟ್ ಪ್ಲಾಂಟ್ಸ್. Not only two different flowers, but also between two different plants. Understood? So this is what the pollination, the difference between autogamy, geitonogamy and allogamy or xenogamy, they may ask. Okay, beautiful questions will come from this concept, pollination concept, very important concept for NEET and CET also. Okay, yes. Okay, I hope you have taken this thing. Yeah. Yes. So as we know, autogamy means pollination within the same flower, and one more thing, they don't show any genetic variation. So there is no genetic variations. Okay. So what makes to maintain these two things? So there are certain conditions which maintains, which happens to be the pollination within the same flower. Those conditions are, there are many conditions. So within the conditions, 3 conditions I'll explain you. So the first condition is, if self-pollination should take place, okay, pollination agbeku, self-pollination agbeku andre, so the first condition is the flower must be bisexual, right? So bisexual iruvaga matra enagutte helri? Yes, agbahudu. Okay, self-pollination. Next is, we call it as synchrony. Okay, how we call synchronization? Okay, you mobiles alli nodtirbodu, ivagantu ellaru mobiles galanna use ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಿ, you all are using mobiles, so there will be a pop-up message every time, synchronization or sync your accounts, okay, or contacts with your accounts anta ಹೇಳ್ತಿರ್ತಾರೆ. That is synchronization. So what happens if something, if the two events are happening, just imagine, like any example it may be, if 2 events are happening, so there should be synchronization between 2 events. Okay, understood? Arthaita? So in the same way, in synchrony, here it is called as, there should be synchrony between pollen grain release and stigma receptiveness. Okay, or it is also called as receptivity. So ಯಾವುದ್ರಗಳ ಮಧ್ಯ synchronization ಇರಬೇಕು ಇಲ್ಲಿ? When the flower should undergo self pollination ಅಂದಾಗ, so the first category is, they must be maximum bisexual flowers self pollinate. Okay, next condition is synchrony. There must be a synchrony between what? The pollen grain release. So from the anther we know pollen grains are formed and they are dispersed. Okay, this pollen grains, now what happens? They should get reside on what? The surface of stigma. And one more thing, not only landing on stigma makes them undergo fertilization, even the stigma need to receive the pollen grain. So ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, anther ಇಂದ just imagine ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ರಿ, pollen grain release ಆಯಿತು ಅಂತ ತಿಳ್ಕೊಳ್ರಿ. ರಿಲೀಸ್ ಆಗಿರೋ ತಕ್ಷಣ ಸ್ಟಿಗ್ಮಾ ಮೇಲೆ ಹೋಗಿ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಆದಾಗ, ಪಾಲಿನೇಷನ್ ಆದಾಗ, ಸೊ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಸ್ಟಿಗ್ಮಾ ಕೂಡ ರೆಡಿ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಸ್ಟಿಗ್ಮಾ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ಶುಡ್ get ready to receive that pollen grain for the fertilization process. Just imagine, if the stigma is not at all ready, then what happens to the pollen grains? Pollen grains, they land till viability, they stay alive. After viability, they get destroyed. We know what is viability. So this is what we call it as synchronization. In the same way, idu lagu agatte. Stigma is ready anta tilkolli. The stigma is ready, but the pollen grain is not at all dispersed or dehisced out from the anther. Pollen grain anther inda horgade bande illa anta tilkolri. Then what happens? there is no fertilization, there is no synchrony. Okay, ಈ ಎರಡು ಇವೆಂಟ್ಸ್ಗಳಿಗೆ synchronization illa andre enagutte, there is no self pollination. Okay, so hence this is also very important. And the next condition is proximity. Okay, what do you mean by proximity? Proximal distance means a close distance. Okay, means between the stamen and pistil. Okay, ಈ stamen ಗೂ ಮತ್ತೆ ಈ pistil ಗೂ ಏನಿರಬೇಕು, proximity ಇರಬೇಕು, means they should be close enough. Okay, if they are close enough only, from the anther the pollen grain will transfer into the or on the surface of stigma. If they are very far, then what happens if it is too far? Yes, there is cross pollination. To perform self pollination, what happens? Proximity matters, the distance matters. The distance should be very less. Okay, they should be together to perform the self pollination. So this is what the conditions for self pollination. Next, based on this condition, there are some flowers which beautifully express or perform self pollination. Okay, so those flowers are Chasmogamous flower, Clistogamous flower. So what is chasmogamous flower? Chasmogam or chasmo means open flower. Open flower means after the production of flowers, so flowers are always open like this, means once the flowers are open, both the stigma and anthers, okay, that is pistil as well as stamens are exposed. Okay, this is what we call it as chasmogamous flowers. And what happens, they undergo a kind of autogamy, self pollination. That pollination we call it as chasmogamy. Okay, chasmogamous is the flower, kind of flower name where the flowers are always open and both the reproductive parts are exposed. Okay, and next, the kind of pollination, the self pollination in chasmogamous or the one performed by the chasmogamous flower are called as chasmogamy. So here, what is clistogamous? Clisto means closed flower, means the flowers never bloom only, they never open. The flowers are always closed. If the flowers are closed, just imagine what kind of pollination they undergo. 100% they undergo self pollination. Why? Because if some pollen grains, if they come and shed on the flower also, the flower is not open to allow them. So what happens? Within the flower only, their own pollen grain is there and their own female reproductive part is there. So what happens? They must and should undergo self pollination. Such kind of self pollination which is performed by clistogamous flower is called as clistogamy. Understood? And there are few examples you should remember. Okay, oxalis plant, okay, viola, commelina. So these are the plants which exhibits chasmogamy and clistogamy kind of self pollination. Understood? So this is about the brief introduction for self pollination. And one more important thing for self pollination, because they are bisexual flowers sometimes, because they are sometimes closed, okay, because they perform self pollination, they don't need anyone's help like pollinating agents help. There are some different pollinating agents like water, it may be wind, it may be sometimes animals, birds, insects, all kind of agents are there. because of they undergo self-pollination, they don't need any kind of agents, the one who perform the pollination. So this is the speciality. But for cross-pollination, what happens? There is no self thing there. Okay, maybe the plants will be in the distant. So what happens? To travel from one place, the pollen grain should travel from this plant to this plant stigma. Then what they need? They need some agents for the transfer, for the pollination. So for cross pollination, must and should they need what? Pollinating agents. Where in self pollinations, so there is no conditions, so they need to have pollinating agents. Okay, in the next sessions we'll deal with the cross pollination, pollinating agents, and few examples how the plants undergo or show the pollination using pollinating agents.